Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Nicholas Phillips, and I have the pleasure of chairing this meeting. And I have to start with some matters of housekeeping, not alas the conventional directions as to how to leave the building in the event of fire, but matters that are relevant to this virtual meeting. The first is that you should see on the bottom of your screen a little globe, and underneath that the word interpretation. If you would rather follow this in Spanish, then click on that globe and you'll have the Spanish version of the proceedings. Next to that, at least on my screen next to it, there's another icon, and that has underneath it Q&A. And you have to click on that should you wish to ask a question. The time for asking questions will come at the end of each panel session. If we go to time, there'll be about 10 minutes for questions after each of those sessions. Now, this webinar is sponsored by the United Kingdom section of Peace Brigades International, by Lawyers Against Poverty, and by the Alliance for Lawyers at Risk. I'm a member of the first and of the last of these. And that is a result of the influence of my very good friend, Sir Henry Brooke, who founded the first, was patron of the last, and who sadly died almost exactly 3 years ago. The Day of the Endangered Lawyer commemorates the slaughter by right-wing thugs of 5 Spanish lawyers at their Atocha Street offices in Madrid on the 24th of January 1977. This was a seminal event in the development of democracy in Spain after Franco. But there are, alas, parts of the world where lawyers' lives are still at risk from political agencies or even from government agents, where trying to stand up for the rule of law can result in arrest, imprisonment, or even death. For the last 4 years, the Law Society has kept a record of such incidents on its intervention tracker. It is remarkable how many lawyers and their supporters are prepared to stand up for the rule of law and for those suffering from its abuse in these countries, despite the personal risk that this involves. It is impossible to overestimate how much it matters to these brave men and women that their efforts in support of the rule of law should be recognized, acknowledged, and supported by lawyers and others who have the good fortune to live in countries such as the United Kingdom, where the rule of law is a prized reality. Providing that acknowledgement and support is what the 3 organizations sponsoring this webinar are all about. You're now going to see a film in which you will hear from some of those providing that support and some receiving it. And this will be followed by 2 panel sessions. Before each of those sessions, I will introduce the chair of the panel, who will then introduce the panel. And so let's move straight to the film. It was made by Manu Valcarce, a Spanish filmmaker, working with Peace Brigade International UK, the Alliance for Lawyers at Risk, and Simmons & Simmons.
It's always worth lawyers, I think, going back and revisiting what they understand by the rule of law.
So the rule of law is all about fairness, due process, access to justice.
A set of principles through which all aspects of life can be conducted.
Those rules keep us safe and give us justice, and I call that the rule of law.
Because it gives us a mechanism by which we can enforce rights and have rights.
Of how law should be used to improve people's lives.
So effective and humane justice system and institutions are fundamental to building societies that facilitate growth and development.
The rule of law not being necessarily something that we consider on a day-to-day basis in the comfort of our jobs.
We do not value the rule of law sufficiently.
In a society without the rule of law, citizens will experience a fragmented and frequently ineffective legal and judicial system, and a significant lack of capacity and accountability of government institutions.
You immediately feel it. You immediately, again, start to have your safety rug start to be tugged from under you. That safety rug of the rule of law.
Without it, there ceases to be legal certainty and legal protection, and that's ultimately what hurts the vulnerable the most. They're the people who feel it first.
And that means that there will be an increase in attacks on members of the legal profession and human rights defenders because they will be more vulnerable to criminal activity.
What we do see in many jurisdictions is stigmatization of lawyers who are representing those who governments don't agree with or are a thorn in the side of governments.
I'd say oppressive techniques used against a lot of people, that PBI companies, and this has really become a big thing in recent years, has been the criminalization of human rights defenders.
You can't help but respond to it, particularly just being vilified by the authorities and the state as well. I find really shocking. I mean, where that is meant to be, that's where your support should be from.
And Kahar itself was receiving not only death threats, but attempts to bug their offices, also defamatory campaigns in the press.
People might be kidnapped for a certain number of hours, be threatened that if they didn't stop their work, then there would be worse repercussions to come. People would approach their friends, their loved one, and tell them to pass on a message. Sometimes that would be coded, sometimes it would be an outright threat. But certainly family members were not off limits, nor were children. It wasn't uncommon for people's children to be approached outside their school.
Threats from sectors of military intelligence, threats from some units of the police, threats from unknown individuals. None of these were duly investigated.
Corruption has a devastating effect in the entire justice system, because it seeks to perpetuate impunity.
In a situation like in Uraba, was that I enjoyed a degree of protection that local people didn't. Nonetheless, I remember being followed in the street. I remember people coming up to me in pickup trucks, slowing down as I walked down the street.
Appalling that people should be subject to threats for doing their job properly and for defending rights. The state should make sure they aren't threatened.
And that was low-level intimidation by comparison. But the chill I felt at being approached by people with very sinister motives was very powerful. And it gave me just a little glimpse of what Colombians deal with day after day.
I think it's a huge luxury being a lawyer working in human rights in this country. I don't face threats going to court.
That one's able to live a very normal life. Quite often when I visit other countries, one has armed protection.
I'm always happy and proud to tell people what I do. That's a luxury that's simply not reality for people operating in fragile societies.
And that they would carry on doing that work despite terrible things happening.
As a fellow professional, you feel, well, how could I work in those circumstances? You hope you would be able to, but until you actually face the risks, you can't say, can you? It's very easy to say things from the safety of where we are now.
I'm just humbled by that kind of work because I struggle to see whether I could do it in those kind of circumstances.
People's family members were killed, and being there with those people while they sort of worked through that grief but carried on with their work was amazing. And I just left with a feeling of admiration at the struggle that people were engaged in.
It is just it's a different world. So, you do wonder what actually you can do to help in that world, or indeed how you would react if you were in it.
I found working in pro bono work alongside organisations like Peace Brigade International not only humbling, but also very educational for me.
PBI UK indirectly works towards supporting the rule of law. And it does that essentially by the work the PBI does with lawyers and victims groups and various other human rights defenders in the field.
And I think the purpose of the Alliance is simply for a set of people who share values but recognise they are privileged to at least feel they are trying to do something to support people for whom those very same things are a danger and a risk.
And I do consider that we have a responsibility within the UK to work to protect lawyers and human rights defenders in Colombia, Honduras, Kenya, so many countries around the world where they do need our support.
And the international community was very much there to echo and reinforce what they were saying and ensure that the information of what was happening on the ground and what the local civilian civic society groups were asking for, well, to amplify that and take that to the decision makers outside of Colombia, into the UN or to the inter-American sphere.
And I really considered that just the fact of them knowing that we are watching and that we're listening when there is an issue does, in my experience, it certainly does seem to help them.
I met human rights lawyers for the first time in London, in fact, and was astonished by their bravery and how they managed to continue to work in the face of these threats.
They need to know how important they are to the world of global justice. They are making a huge difference within their own particular countries and their own states in helping the vulnerable, helping those without a voice.
And that's why human rights defenders often play an essential role in allowing victims, and often in countries in which it's difficult to get access is where you get the worst violations of human rights. So human rights defenders play an essential role in giving voice to victims.
And I just remember that when the lawyer for the victim stood up to speak, she had the whole room gripped, and she was really able to inject that humanity into the court process. And I just thought it was such an important job, and that really she was doing history.
Glimpses of what should be done through their work. Without them, I think that task would be unachievable.
Because to stand up, knowing that you're not just standing up against those military officers who are outside, but the whole system behind them, it was really something quite remarkable. And I thought, wow, this is where change happens.
I was particularly struck by the inventiveness, resilience, and their attachment to the rule of law to try and find ways of making international law work for them, how to apply it in the field, in the middle of the Darien jungle.
But also they are contributing on the international stage to keep the international law strong by using it to hold governments and executives to account.
Because if they were not there, the waters would close over the rule of law.
The reasons that you are not doing it are not money or status, because the lawyers that we accompany don't have much of either, I suspect, within the countries where they work.
I think they are moved by their ability to be compassionate, to have empathy of the suffering and the marginalization of communities or even people.
Their search for truth and their search for justice is relentless.
In a way, they embody what they are going after. So that keeps them motivated. They believe that what they are doing is the right thing.
I mean, if they weren't doing the job, where would the country be?
And it's always a really humbling experience to realise not only that these are people of extraordinary legal ability, of extraordinary commitment to human rights, but also just absolute bravery.
I imagine that their job is scary and that they feel that fear, but to be able to manage that and to be able to work with that kind of fear alongside you is really something remarkable and very admirable, and of course it's inspiring.
Him deciding that the ultimate outcome is a higher priority than his own well-being, and that is remarkable. There are very few people, I think, around the world who do that, and he is one of them.
But I have been very impressed to see the way that the lawyers who work with PBI are defending human rights, not just the environment, but other rights, in much more challenging circumstances than we face here.
And so I always have a kind of a mix of admiration, of humbleness and respect. And also there's a bit of me that's also, you know, kind of takes pride in being part of a profession that they're members of as well.
My philosophy has always been that we've all got an awful lot to learn. Yes, we are lucky. Yes, we take things for granted. Yes, we haven't had a judge convicted of corruption for 200 years. And when I go around the world, and it's not only with PBI, with the Slynn Foundation in Eastern Europe, with the Commonwealth judges in Black Africa and the Caribbean, one sees brave lawyers standing up for the rule of law, wanting to join in partnerships with us. And it's a partnership of equals. It's not a partnership of teachers and learners in any way. And it is really quite inspiring to be able to be involved in that partnership.
Well, others have observed that that's a film that ought to be compulsory viewing for members of the executive all around the world, and indeed in this country. In that film, we heard a little of the difficulties and dangers that you will encounter if you try to uphold the rule of law and defend human rights in some of the countries of the world. One of these speakers was from Colombia. I've traveled in that country, but I know much better two other countries in which PBI is active, Kenya and Nepal, both of which are represented on the first panel this evening. In each of these countries, I've experienced warmth and friendship from those who live there. And you can understand why there are lawyers in those countries who are prepared to disregard their own safety to support the right of their fellows. But you cannot fail to admire the courage with which they do so, and to reflect on how lucky we are in this country that we do not put ourselves at risk when acting for litigants or defendants, however unattractive their fellow citizens may find them, or indeed the executive itself may consider their causes to be. We heard in that film from quite a number of those who are lucky enough to practice law in this country, of the importance that they attach to supporting human rights defenders abroad, and of just how important that support is to them. They're appealing, are they not, to the rest of us to help in any way we can with their endeavours. One of those you saw in the film was Kirsty Brimelow, who's now going to chair the first panel session. Kirsty is a Queen's Counsel who practices from Doughty Street Chambers. There she is head of International Human Rights Team, and she is also a former chair of the Bar Human Rights Committee. Kirsty, welcome. May I invite you to introduce your panel, please?
Thank you very much.
Before I move on to introductions of the panel today, actually advertising this event led to contact to us from those who are working in the Philippines and in Sri Lanka. And one fact which we thought would be poignant as well as interesting is that the Philippines remains one of the most dangerous countries for lawyers in the world, and it has been so for a number of years, with 62 lawyers having been killed in 54 months. And also in Sri Lanka, our attention was drawn to a Justice for Hejaz campaign, a lawyer who remains in detention after 9 months. Colombia has been mentioned, and I know that Germán Romero is going to speak of his work in Colombia. I'm going to just raise a few words that were said by President Santos in 2013 when he was then president. And this was after my work mediating in Colombia between San Jose de Apartador peace community that I'm sure Germán will mention, and also the Colombian state. And I mediated to get a public apology from the state to the community for a past massacre. And he said this. He said, "We do not agree with phrases or attitudes which stigmatize those who strive for peace and reject violence. On the contrary, we consider that every defender of peace and human rights must be praised and protected. For this, we ask for forgiveness. I ask for forgiveness, and I do so with the knowledge that forgiveness is a condition of peace, and that peace is the only guarantor that there will be no more victims." And if I can move to introduce our panel, we have Germán Romero, who is a human rights lawyer in Colombia, and he has worked with San Jose, the peace community, San Jose de Apartador. He's also worked for victims of the 1985 siege of the Palace of Justice. He currently is involved in working in cases being brought before the HEP, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace in Colombia, which was set up after the signing of the peace accord in 2016. And he is going to share his insights on the path towards full justice, the fight against impunity in Colombia, and speak of criminalization of social protest. We have Stephen Kinosia Mwangi, who is a Kenyan human rights paralegal, and he works at the Matari Social Justice Organization. He's also training as a lawyer, and he provides advice and support to the community and also to social movements and social movement platforms. Originally from Nepal, but happily with us for a little while in the UK, is Mandira Sharma. She co-founded the Advocacy Forum in 2001, which was a fantastic organization supporting human rights in Nepal and bringing some important litigation in the human rights area. She studied in Kathmandu, but currently is studying an LLM at the University of Essex. And finally, we have John Dew, who has an incredible career in diplomacy across the world. And I met him in Colombia when he was the ambassador to the UK in Colombia and was a huge supporter then of human rights work. He has worked in Havana prior to being posted before his retirement in Bogota, and he since 2012 has a career as a painter and printmaker. And so if I may ask our first panelist, please, and you all have just about 3 minutes each, and then we'll come for questions. So Germán Romero, please.
Hola, buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Mi nombre es Germán Romero Sánchez. Soy abogado de la organización DH Colombia, que trabaja casos de graves violaciones de derechos humanos cometidos por agentes de Estado en Colombia, casos de restitución y garantía del derecho a la tierra de comunidades campesinas, indígenas y afrodescendientes, y también llevamos algunos casos de lucha contra la tolerancia estatal a la violencia de género. Pues yo creo que se han dicho muchas cosas alrededor de las dificultades que hay en Colombia para el ejercicio de la profesión. Creería que es importante adicionar que nuestro Estado de Derecho es casi inexistente. La fragilidad de la administración de justicia ordinaria y transicional en Colombia es muy profunda. Tenemos unas tasas de impunidad altísima y cuando estas vinculan a agentes de Estado es aún mucho más grave. Adicionalmente a eso, los niveles de persecución que viven las comunidades, los familiares y las víctimas es altísima y creo que es tal vez la situación más delicada. Los abogados, las abogadas y las organizaciones tenemos también una serie de situaciones de amenazas, pero quisiera yo decir dos cosas muy concretamente. Primero, el equipo de nosotros, DH Colombia, desde el 2019 ha sido sistemáticamente perseguido, ya de tiempo atrás lo tenemos. Nosotros vivimos con esquemas de protección, carros blindados, medidas fuertes de protección y pese a ello tenemos un riesgo permanente. Pero desde el 2019 nuestras comunicaciones han sido interceptadas, nuestros computadores, nuestros correos, a mí me robaron toda la información en 2019, han sido amenazadas las familias, mis hijas, y también hemos podido identificar planes para atentar contra las abogadas del equipo a través de la destrucción de las cámaras de seguridad, y todo esto vinculado a los casos contra el Ejército y la Policía Nacional. Más grave aún es el caso de la Comunidad de Paz de San José de Apartadó, una comunidad que se declaró neutra ante el conflicto armado y la cual recientemente ha venido siendo censurada por parte del Ejército Nacional con una gravedad suma, en tal medida que la Corte Constitucional, esa corte que era un ejemplo en el mundo por la garantía de derechos, ordenó que la Comunidad de Paz no podía volver a denunciar los vínculos entre el ejército colombiano y aparatos paramilitares. Esto mediante una sentencia de septiembre del año pasado, que junto a ellos hemos logrado presentar un último recurso ante la misma Corte, se llama un recurso de nulidad, porque creemos que viola estándares internacionales de la libertad de expresión y del derecho a denunciar graves violaciones de derechos humanos. Hoy hacemos un llamado a acompañar este tipo de acción de la Comunidad de Paz ante la Corte Constitucional colombiana. Creemos que los abogados del mundo y sus asociaciones deben exigirle a las altas cortes colombianas la posibilidad de que una comunidad indefensa pueda denunciar cuando hay graves violaciones de derechos humanos y cuando el ejército las presenta, y también hacemos un llamamiento a que puedan acompañar nuestra labor que hacemos día a día. Hoy tuvimos una audiencia donde se declaró la responsabilidad de un policía en el marco de un asesinato de un niño de 15 años en una protesta, 15 años después de ocurridos los hechos, y hoy toda la mañana estuvimos los dos abogados que estamos vinculados al caso incomunicados, nuestros celulares interceptados, no podíamos mandarnos mensajes. Es un poco el ejemplo de lo que vivimos día a día y creemos que los colegas de todo el mundo y los colegas que están en una situación de exigibilidad internacional deben decirle al Estado colombiano y pueden echarnos una mano acompañándonos en las audiencias, en las iniciativas como la de contra la decisión de la Corte Constitucional en la Comunidad de Paz y obviamente pudiendo exigir cada vez más el respeto por nuestra labor que pues es casi prácticamente nulo al día de hoy en un Estado de Derecho que es inexistente y la concentración del poder en Colombia es altísima. Hoy el fiscal general, el procurador general, el defensor del pueblo, son los mejores amigos del presidente de estudio, es decir, que la concentración de poder hace que la justicia sea una ilusión en Colombia. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And if I can now introduce or ask to speak to us, Stephen Kinothia Mwangi, please.
Yes, my name is Stephen Mwangi from the Matari Social Justice Center, but also a part of the larger social justice movement. And our work is largely based on the advocacy for social justice in the informal settlements of Nairobi. That's where we are largely based. But we are also we've also opened centers in other parts of this country, in Mombasa, Kisumu, in Kajiado, many justice centers in informal settlements. And our work is based on 3 principles. The principle of education, educating the members of these communities. Principle of organizing members of these communities so that they can be able to advocate for their own rights, to advocate for what they've been denied, what they've been marginalized from accessing. And on liberation. Liberation is really saying that we cannot be able to fight without an end in mind. And this end for us is liberation. And I'd like to talk about these 3 things as I respond to my main points for this talk. And the role really of the social justice movement is to denormalize violence, to denormalize what people have assumed is the status quo, that this is the way that people should live. And since I was a young boy, I've grown up in a community where young men have been brutally murdered by the police. I've grown up in a community where there is no water. I've grown up in a community where there is no adequate access to healthcare, where if you get sick, your entire family is reduced to almost a state of destitution. And reflecting on all these issues, we came together first as students, we came together as researchers in the community, and together with activists. And what we realized is that people have assumed this is the way things should be like. And towards education, we organized community dialogue. And through these community dialogues, we're able to engage with community members so that we can be able to all understand, collectively think about the issue in the community. And from that, we've been able to highlight extrajudicial killings to a national dialogue, where the entire country is now focusing on the issue of police brutality. And further to that, we've also addressed the issue of social injustices that arise out of a lack of accessing food, a lack of accessing water, a lack of accessing education, and the need for social security. And from this, we've been able to develop committees, several committees that tackle these issues thematically. And one particular committee is the Committee on Article 43. And Article 43 engages community members in informal ways, where we go to bases where women sit together, where young men sit together, or the elderly. And we discuss what do you understand by a lack of access to these things. And out of that, we've been able to bring together students, we've been able to bring together community members who are seen as informal beings in the legal system. And out of that, we've been able to train paralegals. And these paralegals are really community members whom the community goes to as a first stop point, where they go to and address an issue. And if, say, a mother has lost her son to a police execution, they're able to collect information about this, document this, and address it to the relevant channels. One particular channel is the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, and the other one is the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. And when we started, this was community members were very skeptical. They didn't think that anything can come out of it. But over time, we've been able to document cases through particular platforms, informally, where human rights defenders goes and visits a family that has lost a son, and they document the cases. Also, we have a platform called the Missing Voices. It's online. You can check it out. And out of that, we've been able to gather a lot of momentum. We've been able to gather a lot of public psych. And you'll see community members sending information to your inbox, coming to your home and addressing a particular issue. And this has gone a long, long way in addressing the need for community members to access justice. We've been able to open a door where people can discuss what is justice, because the idea of justice had been diluted so much, had lost effectiveness. And at least now we can even proudly say we have justice centers in all the informal settlements of Nairobi. And this work has not been without difficulty. It has not been a walk in the park. It's come with a lot of challenges. Majorly, one of it is the lack of knowledge about the rule of law, the lack of appreciation for the rule of law, and the breakdown in trust in the justice system. However, we've been
Stephen,
able to...
I'm going to step in now. I think there'll be some questions which you'll be asked to answer. So I'm sorry to cut you short.
Sorry, Christy, I don't think I can hear you.
Can you not hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. We're just going to have to cut you short now, and then we'll come back to you with questions. Sorry, I'll try and send him a direct message. I think he's got it. Thank you very much. And if I can pass on now to Mandira Sharma, please. If we could try and keep to around 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy, and thanks to PBI for this opportunity. Very nice to see you all, and good evening. I think in the last few years, Nepal has made a significant progress in number of fronts. We have signed comprehensive peace agreement ending very brutal conflict. It does promise a lot of respect to human rights and fundamental changes in the configurations of powers. We also have a new constitution drafted by the Constituent Assembly members that were elected by the people. The constitution does provide fundamental rights. It embraces the notions of justice, equality, rule of law. We do also have separation of power and independence of judiciary. Nepal has also ratified several international human rights treaties. So in paper, we do have a lot of protection of human rights. And for lawyer, human rights defenders like us, what we really try to do is a sort of basic thing to really make these promises apply in practice. But unfortunately, demanding this very basic thing sometimes becomes a very uphill sort of battle, even forcing us to pay a sort of highest price. I think what I really wanted to highlight is that one of the areas where we have not been able to bring any changes or any progress is the problem of impunity in this country. Those who are in power are always...
Mandira, sorry, the sound is not very good.
Okay, I'll try to raise. The impunity for those involved in human rights violations is the key challenges, key threats that we have been facing in upholding rule of law and human rights in the country. Those in power are always above the law, and demanding accountability for those involved in gross human rights violations and international crimes such as torture, enforced disappearances, sexual abuse of women, extrajudicial executions are a sort of life-threatening job for human rights defenders and lawyers. We do have very courageous judges as well. We do enjoy some degree of independence of judiciary. We have been able to secure some judgments which are very landmark in terms of upholding human rights standards. But unfortunately, implementations of those decisions are also very, very problematic, very poor. Defiance of rule, decisions of the courts are not only silencing human rights advocates, lawyers, demoralizing victims, but also weakening judiciary quite significantly. In that context, we have been also exploring possibilities of using the human rights standards, the tools, the legal tools that are available at international level as well. We have been trying to bring communications before the Human Rights Committee. We have been also exploring possibilities that are possible outside the jurisdictions. In that context, we have also attempted to bring the case under universal jurisdictions. Although the case was not that successful in terms of having conviction, the jury was hung and there was no retrial again. But nevertheless, this has actually provided a significant impact in shifting the ground on the discourse on transitional justice debate in the country. So I really hope that the possibilities that exist at international level, the legal tool and standards that exist at international level are also extended in support of those lawyers, human rights defenders, and judges fighting in different countries. These sort of legal tools do provide a sort of sense and help to shatter the veil of this impunity, and the perpetrators could feel that the long arm of justice could actually reach to them, although they have been controlling the power at national level. So I think this is the area where I really wanted to thank you all for your support when we were struggling on this case in the UK, and continue to explore in other jurisdictions. I really hope the support will be continued. I'm very much thankful for the Peace Brigade International as well, and also Lawyers at Risk Network, and also UK Bar, Human Rights Bar as well, Human Rights Committee of the Bar, because we have been the recipient of the support. Your press releases, your support actually did provide us a lot of strength when we were facing a lot of difficulties in terms of our security, and I hope you continue to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mandira. And John Jew, please.
Well, it's great to be with you. I'd just like to explain a bit what it's like and what you have to do if you're at the sharp end as a diplomat trying to make some kind of reality of a human rights policy devised back in London. Since the late 1990s, British governments have had quite explicit human rights interests. The Foreign Office has had a human rights department, and the embassies and high commissions have been under instructions to promote and pursue human rights issues. Now, there are two ways of doing that at the sharp end. One is to have a dialogue with the government, which is usually quite difficult because governments don't like discussing human rights issues with foreign governments. They pretend they haven't got human rights problems. They accuse you of interfering in internal affairs, and they generally clam up. After a while, they often become quite expert at batting away human rights issues. Another way is to support human rights defenders, and that's far more effective and does, I think, opens up the issue far more effectively. Human rights defenders need visibility, and governments are quite keen to keep human rights issues invisible. In a lot of countries, including Colombia, which you've discussed, human rights abuses have been what we in this country would say privatized or outsourced. Governments don't give explicit policy instructions to violate human rights. They sit back and watch other people do it for them. And that makes it even more important to see what's really going on. And the way you find out what's going on is to support and talk to and develop relationships with human rights defenders. Human rights defenders need visibility because in many countries, public opinion isn't really interested. Public opinion can be inured to human rights abuses. Over so many years, so many difficulties, human capacity for indignation gets blunted. And even the word human right, even the phrase human rights abuses has a kind of abstract sort of, it can be battered away. You have to keep reminding yourself and other people that human rights abuses are actually usually serious crimes. And governments, are quite good at batting away human rights issues, and they often devote more effort to, or appear to devote more effort to, dealing with criticism and developing arguments and countering sort of attempts to raise these issues, devote more effort to that than to tackling the actual abuses themselves. I think over time, two principles emerge as being helpful to having these discussions. One is to say that human rights is to make the point that human rights defenders are not part of the problem, as so often governments think they are. Human rights defenders are part of the solution. And if governments can accept that human rights defenders are part of the solution to dealing with their problems, you've made a lot of progress. The other principle, I think, is that the shame is not having human rights abuses in your country. The shame is not dealing with them. And I think that's a point that needs to come across so often, because you needn't be embarrassed that you've got human rights problems. You should be embarrassed that you're not tackling them. And I think that's a key point. I think that you have different levels of success in different countries, but it's still the case that human rights defenders are the key. And by focusing on human rights defenders, you can make more progress than just talking to governments on their own. It's also the case that the present government, we don't know quite what the new FCDO approach will be, but the indications so far are promising. And it's also promising that PBI managed to get the FCO to publish their guidelines on support for human rights defenders 2 years ago. And if you look on the Gov UK website, you will see quite a sort of detailed best practice guide for supporting human rights defenders worldwide. And I think it's quite significant to find that on the sort of broad government UK website. I think there may be more to be done in getting that published in other countries, but it is available in different languages. So it's not easy having these dialogues with foreign governments. It's always difficult. But human rights defenders and giving them visibility is important. Getting across the idea that human rights defenders are part of the solution, not the problem, is crucial. Thank you.
Thank you. I have some questions now to put to the panel. And we've actually got quite a few. So I'm going to select who's answering. And Stephen Mwangi, if I may come to you. One question is about international human rights bodies, such as those that are under the United Nations. And in two parts, do you find that they are effective? And what more is required? So what particular area of human rights work needs more support by international human rights organizations? And linked to that, how effective are your own national human rights organizations? You mentioned the National Human Rights Commission in Kenya, for example. So Stephen, if you can keep that one to answer. I'm going to ask Roman, please. There's a question about how is it possible to experience anything like normal family life when you are living in fear or against a background of conflict, if you wouldn't mind taking that one. And I have a question, if I can also ask you, Roman, to look at the impact that COVID-19 and increased reliance on IT has for defenders, because you've also mentioned that conversations are monitored. And John Jew, if I could ask you, when you speak about human rights defenders not being seen as part of the problem, from your experience as a diplomat, and I'm also going to open this up to the rest of the panel, can you compare mechanisms as to how different states deal with issues raised by human rights defenders? Now, here we have Colombia, Kenya, and Nepal. I appreciate you might not necessarily have the same insight, Mr. Jew, on Kenya and Nepal as Colombia, but perhaps you could have a go at tackling that question. And John as well, any security risks towards diplomats that you have experienced when perhaps being seen to align yourself with human rights defenders and lawyers? And if I could ask, please, Mandira, as well, can you expand any more on other policy initiatives that you think the UK should be pursuing now that it has come out of the EU, and that potentially there's a loss of protections from the EU? So I think that's probably covered most of them. And Germán, if I could start with you and then come on to Stephen, please.
Vale, gracias. ¿Me escuchan? Bueno, son dos preguntas. La primera no muy fácil de responder, la segunda creo que sí es más clara y concreta. Creo que es como el compromiso y la mística que tienes con la defensa de derechos humanos y el ejercicio de la abogacía para romper ese silencio de las personas que sufren los más duros horrores de la represión y de la violencia estatal, que es lo que lo mantiene a uno de pie. Tratando de hacer este tipo de labores y un ejercicio de litigio estratégico a nivel interno y a nivel internacional. ¿Cómo lograr eso con una vida tranquila de familia? Es muy difícil. Yo desde el nacimiento de mi primera hija tuve que negarla en los reportajes, me preguntaban que si tenía familia, me tocaba decir que no, pues ya hoy en día es imposible, tengo dos. Yo tengo 39 años, yo llevo exactamente 16 años de ejercicio ininterrumpido como abogado defensor de derechos humanos y creo que la familia ya me está pidiendo el retiro y creo que las fuerzas de a poco se van debilitando, ¿no? Yo siento que lo ocurrido en los últimos 2 años ha generado profundo cansancio, pero bueno, hay días muy importantes. Hoy logramos una sentencia, como les decía, muy valiosa y un precedente muy fuerte para la lucha contra la brutalidad policial en Colombia, que no había existido hasta el día de hoy, y creo que eso, ver la satisfacción triste del padre de la víctima, del niño víctima, ayuda para seguir con esto que podríamos llamar tranquilidad, pero sí, se transforma la vida de tus hijos, de tu pareja, de tu madre. A mi madre le rompen los vidrios, le golpean las puertas en las noches, a mi compañera permanente la amenazan. Mis hijas ya conocen a PBI, conocen a todos los brigadistas de PBI, saben sus nombres, saben que nos están acompañando para protegernos, y por eso quiero extender el más grande de los agradecimientos a PBI por la labor que hacen. Y frente a la segunda pregunta, tiene nombre propio. La pandemia del COVID-19 ha desatado y ha consolidado el Estado policial. El control del Estado policial se ha trasladado no solamente de las expresiones ciudadanas y de las políticas públicas, sino ahora se ha trasladado a los cuerpos y a las tecnologías. Entonces el nivel de control de la información es mucho más alto. La defensa de derechos humanos en materia virtual no es tan fácil. Creo que acá hay un punto complicado entre la necesidad de estar en terreno y la necesidad de la bioseguridad y la protección de la vida por la enfermedad de la COVID-19, pero creo que lo más grave que nos ha ocurrido son estos estados policiales. Antes era más difícil que a mí me estuvieran vigilando. Yo veía vigilancias en las audiencias, en la calle, en otras ciudades cuando llegaba al aeropuerto. El año pasado, durante toda la pandemia, durante 6 meses seguidos, pude apreciar al frente de mi casa carros de vigilancia, pues porque me tenían encerrado y era más fácil vigilarme. Entonces podrán imaginarse el nivel de acceso a las comunicaciones y a la vida familiar y a la vida laboral que tienen los aparatos de inteligencia del Estado, que tengo la certeza de nuestro equipo.
Gracias, Germán.
Kirsty, I'm afraid I'm going to have to intervene, because if we take all those questions, we'll have finished all our time before we get to the second panel. We're already overshot.
Right.
So there may be time for questions at the end of the session, and there's a suggestion that this can go on Twitter if it can't go on the present format. But I must now invite Chris Owen to introduce his panel. I have to introduce him very briefly. Chris is a partner in Simmons & Simmons, the firm of solicitors who helped to make the film we saw, and they are very strong supporters of the work that film was all about. He is a member of Lawyers Against Poverty. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. Well, we've got a huge amount of experience on the panel, as I will introduce very shortly, of those involved in actions to help support the rule of law and human rights defenders. But what we're going to look at on this panel is how best can that support be delivered, both to lawyers in the field and to human rights and rule of law defenders elsewhere. It's a very significant question, because we know from our experience that whilst there is a great demand for assistance, it's not always straightforward to be able to deliver that in a meaningful and impactful way. And so looking at that issue, I've got four excellent panelists. Richard Lord QC, a barrister of over 35 years from Brick Court. He's a commercial litigator with an interest in human rights and climate change, and is chair of the Action for Justice group. Emma Lowe, who is the director at Lawyers Against Poverty, which is the global movement of lawyers and social justice advocates who are committed to alleviate poverty worldwide. Sue Willman, who is she's a litigator at Dayton Pierce Glynn in public law and human rights, but also chairs the Human Rights Committee of the Law Society of England and Wales. And she's a founding member of the Columbia Caravana UK Lawyers Division, and an assistant director at King's College London's Law Clinic on Environment and Human Rights. And last but by no means least is Susie Bascom, Director of Peace Brigades International UK. Peace Brigades, as many of us know, supports hundreds and thousands of human rights defenders. And she, along with Sir Henry Brooke, launched the Alliance for Lawyers at Risk in 2010, providing support to human rights defenders at risk. First up is Richard Lord QC. Richard, interested in your thoughts on this topic.
Thank you, Chris. And as you say, the question often arises how those of us in Europe and in England can support and provide practical help to endangered lawyers, particularly in the global south. It's something we think about a great deal of action for justice, and good intentions are not enough. And as others have pointed out, endangered lawyers almost invariably have a huge amount of legal knowledge, a full understanding of local conditions and realities on the ground, and a courage and determination which we admire and take as a source of inspiration. So what can we add to that? Well, in our experience, there are three particular things that are all related. And the first is to provide information and support in relation to international mechanisms, and as collaborators discussing the way these can be used. And so this includes not only a knowledge of internationally applicable laws on human rights and the environment, but also an understanding of how a solution to a problem in one place is often in another place. So problems in Honduras or the DRC or Cambodia may lie in London or New York or Paris, and this is particularly so for lawyers endangered by activities of local subsidiaries of certain corporate activities or financed by international IFCs. The second related area is to encourage collaboration between lawyers of different disciplines. And so very often we're used to labeling a problem in a particular way, but if you've got, for example, the common problem of lawyers representing indigenous peoples threatened by an extractive project, how do you label it? Is it an environmental one? Is it a human rights one? Is it a land problem? Is it a supply chain one? Is it a criminal one? Or is it something else? And the answer is it's often all of those. And connecting local lawyers with different disciplines is helpful, because frequently if you're looking for solutions to problems, it's about a menu of possible legal actions based on different types of action. And thirdly, although legal solutions have to work for the endangered lawyer where they are, patterns emerge globally with the same type of threat, the same type of pressures, whether it's imprisonment, unsustainable defamation charges, physical assaults, or whatever. And so solutions developed in one continent or country can, with some local adaptation, be used elsewhere. and Action for Justice seeks to empower those in the global south to uphold human rights. It does so by a website and by its network of connections, but let me finish with a practical example, because it's very easy to speak in these abstract ways. Our partners in Myanmar were working to protect lawyers who were often imprisoned for their human rights work. And one of the biggest problems was the continual adjournment of cases by the prosecution, such that they would turn up to court with their supporters and their lawyers, and it would just be adjourned time and time again, and they remained in detention. And what was of most use weren't some of the very big, expensive, glossy brochures produced by some of the international aid agencies on international human rights, but developing a culture which had not until then been known, of challenging this practice of adjournment, which was never done then because it wasn't the way things worked. And although it wasn't always successful, that developed a sense of ability to challenge one of the most difficult things in practice. But I think I've had my 3 minutes. Anyone else interested in what we do is welcome to contact us. So thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Richard. Very interesting insights. Emma, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. So for context, Lawyers Against Poverty was set up in 2015 as an Oxfam project and launched last year as an independent charity with a mission to inspire and mobilise a growing movement of lawyers and members of the wider legal community to use the skills and resources within it to contribute to the alleviation of poverty and inequality. So a big question for us is what we can usefully do in an environment where our resources are limited and the challenges for human rights defenders significant. And in answer to this, we've chosen to focus our energies as an organisation in 3 areas. Firstly, on building meaningful ties within the legal community, and then on continuing to learn and sharing these insights. And then finally, on taking action where we feel that we can have an impact. So to start with, building a meaningful sense of community provides the foundation for our wider work. And one way in which we build these relationships is through pairing lawyers through our twinning program, so that lawyers working in different regions can become peer mentors to learn from one another's experience, to provide moral support, and build a connection outside their immediate professional networks. And this is a model that we started to offer to law students so that they can broaden their interests and help each other with projects, and to academic researchers with the hope that they can use these connections to work on collaborative research projects and provide new analysis. And we've seen that building these connections is a powerful tool at the heart of strong social movements. When, for example, the Occupy Wall Street protesters decamped from New York's financial district in 2011, many in the media declared the moment was over. But just a year later, when Hurricane Sandy hit New York, these same networks leapt into action, spearheading the city's response to the crisis, because they already had these connections and the communications channels to do so. And our second focus is on learning and gathering insight so that we can be more informed, more committed, and more effective advocates. In some ways, we all speak a common language around access to justice and the rule of law, but this can also sometimes be misleading. And when we think, for example, about the issue of the environment, and we might be quicker to agree that it's a priority, but perhaps less so on what we actually mean by that, and what could in different contexts refer to climate justice, indigenous rights, to land protections or environmental degradation, could then lead to very different conversations. And this shows us that there is work to be done in bringing narratives into different spaces and not just listening to ourselves talk over familiar topics. And indeed, not just talking and listening, but really interrogating the principles that we say that we stand for and thinking hard about how we put these into practice. LAP hosted an event last week looking at how organisations could effectively embody feminist principles in their operations and their governance. And we had organisations coming to the idea new and thinking about how to start these conversations within their organisation. And we had activists who were frustrated that organisations weren't engaging more with these issues. And we need to keep having these challenging conversations and with a range of perspectives so that we can work together and troubleshoot these issues and share our lessons to improve our practice. And finally, we gear all our work towards taking action. You know, what can we as lawyers do today that will make a difference tomorrow? And we know that although the law is important, it by itself is often not enough. So one thing that our members do is support projects financially through LAP's Justice Fund, which is a collaborative fund made possible by contributions from our members. And it's through the Justice Fund that we've been able to think more broadly about how we can support the international legal community. And we funded successful litigation in Nigeria to strengthen protections for domestic violence victims. And we supported the provision of legal services in the refugee camps in Lesbos in Greece. And members have recently voted to fund a pilot training program for paralegals in Indonesia to strengthen Indigenous rights to land and embed these skills within the wider community. But where we see the most passion from our members is in their commitment to offer their time and their wider skills as lawyers to support projects with the potential to make a real difference. And LAP is very excited to soon be launching a pilot initiative with Action for Justice and Peace Brigades International UK to mobilise the resources within our network to develop a capacity building legal action programme in partnership with human rights defenders. So with much excitement to that, I think my time is up. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. And as a member of Lawyers Against Poverty myself, I know the great work that you do, much of which you've just described there. So thank you for that. Just a quick reminder to those listening that if there are questions, there will be a short amount of time for questions at the end of this panel. So please do send your questions in whilst we're speaking, and then we will try and deal with those. And so next is Sue. Sue, can I invite you to make your contribution to this discussion? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to try to share my screen as part of my aim to inspire those of you who are not already involved to get involved, and those of you who are involved to get a little bit more involved. I'll try not to talk too quickly since I've got such little time to talk on what you can do and what I've been involved in doing to change the lives of lawyers abroad. And to do that, I'm going to talk about eating pizza, riding a bicycle, and a broken lift with the help of these photos. In 2008, I went on the first visit of the Columbia Caravana UK Lawyers Group to Bogota because lawyers there were facing death threats, seeing their friends killed, going to too many funerals of other lawyers. And it was all a bit chaotic. It was organised by the Law Society. There were a range of people from Basque separatists to the Croydon candidate for the Conservative Party in the next election. And I thought, are these trips abroad to meet lawyers really just about a bit of a Beano, or is there more to it? And my question was answered one evening in the bar, eating pizza with one of the local lawyers and some of the other lawyers from the delegation. In the midst of the banter, he started telling us about the time he was driven around in a car, blindfolded, and then dumped and tortured for 3 days. And then I understood why I was there. And I think that memory is one of the things that has kept me going back to Colombia every 2 years with the Columbia Caravana UK Lawyers Group to find out what's going on there and supporting lawyers, to writing reports and welcoming lawyers to the UK. But faced by the coronavirus, we've really cut off from doing that. And that's why it's so important that PBI has been organising these series of events so that we can carry on giving support to people like Stephen and German and Mandira. I wanted to stress, as Henry Book said, that this is very much about an exchange. I have got so involved in this because I get a lot out of it, not just about going into new areas of law. In my work at King's College, I'm working on amicuses to do with human rights and environment in Colombia and in Uganda, but also, and I think primarily, the commitment and the resilience and the sense of fun and humour that has helped me domestically in my struggles with various Home Secretaries and the Legal Aid Agency. And I hope you get a glimpse of that from the group of lawyers together with our delegation in Colombian lawyer's office. And I've highlighted the visit to the jail, which we often do when we go to Colombia with a caravana, because really people in jails around the world often include political prisoners, and due to overcrowding and a higher risk of COVID, and also due to the fact that we're not visiting at the moment, we're not visiting Colombia, where there have been numerous massacres in the past 12 months, and where 23 prisoners who protested against the lack of protection from COVID were shot dead. And that's making it more important for events like this to try and highlight what is happening there. So with the caravana, we visit delegations who are operating in places along the Caribbean coast, for example, where it's very hard to operate as a lawyer at all because of such a weak infrastructure. But we also meet senior government members, and we meet judges. And this particular judge has had her brothers murdered. She herself and her family had been threatened. And we helped support her in relation to sanctuary, which she was forced to seek in Europe. And my particular hero on a trip to Guatemala, where I've gone with another international legal delegation, is this judge in the pale blue suit, who surprisingly is perhaps the only judge in the world who's convicted a former leader of the country, who's still in the country, for genocide. Rios Montt had been responsible, complicit in the murder of thousands of indigenous people during the Civil War. And of course, this woman who looks so cheerful during our visit is faced with death threats and surveillance. And the point about the lift is that she works in an office on the 13th floor, and there's only 2 lifts, and one of them is often not working. So she has a choice between walking up 13 flights of stairs in her court shoes or sharing a lift with drug traffickers and people charged with murder who are due to be charged, due to be seen in her court. So resources are very much an issue for the people that we go to see, but also the Law Society's recently written a letter in support of her because she's still receiving threats, and she has confirmed how helpful that has been. And then in the past, we welcomed lawyers in the UK and tried to give them a bit of a rest from their very difficult lives in countries like Colombia. The lawyer on the right, Jorge Milano, has had to take a break just because of the level of threats he's had in representing people in Colombia. And then other things that we can do, of course, are to lobby in Parliament on issues like business and human rights, given the involvement of corporations, as we just heard, in environmental and human rights abuses. This was at the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights investigation into business and human rights, and whether or not there should be specific laws here, such as a criminal law to outlaw human rights abuses abroad. So these are some of the actions that the Caravana has been involved in, and actions that could be replicated in other countries abroad. I've probably run out of time. I'm very keen on the idea of other caravanas, Central America caravana, but maybe there could be one in, Asia and Africa. It has worked well to have a cross-section of lawyers going and visiting abroad and keeping in touch, and then coming back and working on issues that we've experienced firsthand and are very, very in our minds, as I hope you have got from my photos. Thank you very much, and I hope you'll get involved.
Thanks, Sue, and thanks for sharing those experiences with this group. And so finally, our last speaker on this panel, Susie. Susie, can I invite you to give your thoughts on how international NGOs and UK government and others should be working to support efforts in this area? Susie.
Yes, thank you, Chris, for the introduction. So The role of human rights defenders, as we've heard throughout the previous panel and then the film and many of the comments of the lawyers who have been accompanying them, is primarily to help uphold the rule of law, to uphold international standards, to ensure that there is access to justice for all. We are very much aware of the challenges that these lawyers and these paralegals need to face in order to be able to contribute to something that in the UK is probably a privilege if you're part of the legal profession. So PBI has been, over the last 30 years, accompanying human rights defenders, lawyers and other types of rights defenders in different countries around the world. We are currently in seven countries. And we do this in a very specific and tailored way. We have an international presence of international observers on the ground. We have teams of volunteers that spend at least a year of their time, of their lives for free, physically shadowing some of these international observers, going to court hearings, like Herman has mentioned, or sleeping at the houses of the defenders if the level of risk that they face is too high. But also the teams on the ground are monitoring, are recording incidents, are doing risk assessments about the security situation of these defenders. And at the same time, they are keeping the interlocution, the dialogue with diplomats such as John Dew. That's why we end up inviting him to become a patron, because he was in the field, supporting volunteers and human rights defenders, with members of the government in question, to remind them of their obligations in terms of following international standards, upholding international standards, and the fact that human rights defenders are accompanied, are followed, are monitored by the international community, and therefore, the eyes and the ears of the international community are watching whatever is happening to them. So our kind of work is very practical and on the ground in the sense of accompanying them, providing them also with moral support. But also at international level, this safety and protection needs to be backed up by all the networks of support that we've built over the years, not only in the UK, but also in other 14 countries where we have a presence. So it is from there that we engage with the UK government, with parliamentarians, with members of the legal community, with academics and other networks. And what we try to do is to ensure that the UK government takes responsibility in terms of upholding human rights, but most importantly, that they see, as John was saying before in his presentation, they see human rights defenders as key players, as key actors in succeeding in this priority of upholding the rule of law. Because defenders are the ones who are in the communities, they are the ones able to achieve sustainable impact and development, they are the ones trusted. They also work with communities that are marginalized, as Stephen was saying. They are completely outside the system, so you wouldn't have, diplomats or even governments having access to those communities. So it is really, really important that the UK government sees defenders as real partners. And PBI has been working over the last few years on helping the UK government to develop these guidelines, best practice guidelines for their diplomats. And we also help brief diplomats before they go into the field and meet them regularly on the ground. And most importantly, we open the channels of communications between the diplomatic corps, the authorities on the ground, and human rights defenders to ensure that there is this conversation going. Beyond that, we have been engaging with the legal community over the last 10 years. We've been working very closely with the Alliance for Lawyers at Risk, as it's been mentioned. The Henry Group was instrumental in helping us to access the legal community, and most importantly, to understand, especially for myself, the mindset of lawyers, and to reach out to these networks that now we have. We've worked with the Law Society also for the many years, and we have received funding. And most recently, we have been working closely with Simmons & Simmons, with the Pro Bono team led by Richard Dighton, the Pro Bono partner, and then Chris Owen and Victoria Channing have been also instrumental in helping us to develop a toolbox for human rights defenders working on issues related to business and human rights and trying to confront corporate abuse. So it's been really enlightening to work with them, particularly because we've seen the value of partnering with lawyers from perhaps a completely different background that have a completely different set of skills and expertise, and yet that they are able to listen and to understand the trends in repression that defenders are facing and be prepared, to produce these capacity building programs. And just to finalize this part of the presentation, to say that we are really pleased that through Simons, who is very much involved in sort of setting up loads of different legal initiatives like Lawyers Against Poverty and the Legal Response Initiative. I think there is a lot of interest within Simons in sort of making sure that the legal community makes more of a contribution, and we are really, really pleased to be able to collaborate with LAB and also now with Action for Justice, and I hope with other legal networks that we might be able to engage with in the future.
Thanks, Susie, and we've certainly enjoyed working with you on the Toolbox project to help human rights defenders. Just before we move to questions, I'm going to answer one general question that's come in from a couple of people, which is how do they get involved in some of these initiatives we've talked about today, including PBI, Lawyers Against Poverty, and Action for Justice. I think the simple answer to that is that the details are on the websites of those respective organisations. So if people have access there, that should be the starting point to sign up. Otherwise, I'm sure that the people who represent those organisations on this panel would be happy to receive an email from you expressing interest. I'm conscious of time, but I think perhaps the question that, looking at them, has resonated the most from people is actually one close to home, which is Brexit, and particularly how the impact of Brexit affects the work that lawyers, particularly in this country, might be able to do to deliver on human rights, help human rights defenders globally. And so maybe I can ask the panel, anyone want to come in on that question, please? Brexit and its impact, if any, on this panel. Otherwise, I'll pick some, but if anyone wants to make an intervention,
okay.
Sue.
I suppose on the one hand, it's a barrier, but on the other hand, it's a great opportunity. We used to think we had to get on a plane to go and meet people, but now we can communicate much more easily as long as the local organisations are going to have resources to get good Wi-Fi and IT, which is obviously an issue in certain countries. But just being able to have like nearly 100 people here, whereas on a cold January evening in central London, probably we would have had a handful of people. So I think it's up to us to make the most of the opportunities, but also think of ensuring that we do connect with the hard to reach communities that may not have, in countries which may not have such good connections, and think about fundraising so that we can keep in touch with them more regularly. And also working online. I mean, things like lawyers who are contributing to Amicus, for example, that's something kind of work that can be done easily without having to travel to the country, whereas other activities may be more difficult. The Caravana is even remotely observing a trial of the brother of Uribe in Colombia, I believe, next week or maybe even this week. So many of the activities can continue.
Thank you. Richard, Emma?
I think it's difficult to tell, but it can be an opportunity. It depends on the attitude of the government, which I'm not privy to, but it presents an opportunity particularly to be flexible and agile, and if the political will is there are a great deal of organizations who would very much like the chance to be more proactive, and so although it's difficult to foresee how it will work out, a potential opportunity.
Thanks. Emma, any thoughts on Brexit and COVID, I guess, as we've been talking about that as well, in terms of this space?
Richard took some of the words out of my mouth. I think my main thoughts are around because there are so many unknowns, the need for the legal community to be proactive and agile, and there will inevitably be issues and we need to be ready to be responsive to them. So thinking about the logistics of how we can do that.
Thank you. I agree with that. And Susie, maybe a final word from you on that question before we hand back.
Yes, to say that, again, we see it also as an opportunity because, in a way, the fact that the UK government is no longer part of the EU means that they have to rethink the way in which they're going to be supporting human rights defenders, because they used to be operating very sort of jointly with embassies on the ground, for example, when implementing something that was called the EU Guidelines for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders. Now, PBI, with other partners, peers such as the Law Society and with Amnesty International and others, we've been, over the course of last year, working towards developing some recommendations towards a strategy for the UK government to consider in the new context, Brexit and the new sort of FCDO context where there is this new merge between the FCO and DFID. So we are taking it as an opportunity to see what else the UK government can do. The UK government likes taking the lead on issues. They are very keen on rule of law issues, on media freedom issues. They're keen on women's rights. So we are exploring how thematically we can sort of engage with them. And in fact, on the 10th of February, we are going to be launching an event with them. With Lord Hammett will be speaking or via video, I think. And we are going to be launching our recommendations for the UK government to listen to what we have to say in terms of how they can partner with human rights defenders and support them more. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. So I think overall, although perhaps some difficulties, actually some opportunities and some potential scope as well to do some new things in perhaps in different ways. So that's good news. And with that, can I thank the panelists? Really interesting discussion. Thank you all very much for your contributions, and hand back to you, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got, I think, about 90 seconds to wind up these proceedings. And first of all, thank you to everybody who's taken part, those who have contributed on the screen and those who've been listening. To the latter, if you're not involved but are tempted to get involved, please give way to that temptation. We do need help from everybody. And finally, a little warning, people give their help pro bono, but we do have administrative expenses necessarily. At the Henry Brook Awards, a very good friend of PBI, Frederick Mulder, generously gave £10,000 and he said he hoped very much that that would be matched. We're halfway towards matching it, but please excuse us if we invite you to help us to find the other half, because as a word of warning, I think we're going to do so. Anyway, thank you all very much. And I hope it may be possible for some of you to remain in contact by Twitter.
Thank you.
Thank you.